5 in the morning, no light in the kitchen except the blue ring of a gas burner, and someone is already warming a comal. That was how breakfast started in a Mexican-American house before anyone owned a toaster or a microwave. A handful of masa, 2 eggs, whatever sat in the back of the refrigerator, and a plate hit the table before the sun came up. Number 15 was nothing more than a tortilla dragged through tomato sauce, and it put enchiladas to shame. Number 9 kept ranch families fed across the northern desert on nothing but salt and dried beef. And number 1 turned last night's leftovers into the richest plate of the morning. Here are 25 forgotten Mexican breakfast plates that belong back on the table. So hit subscribe, because these are the kitchens that wrote the real recipes. Number 25, Harina con agua. The simplest breakfast a Mexican kitchen could produce: flour, water, a pinch of salt, and a hot comal. Nothing more. In the 1950s and 1960s, families along the Texas border made these thin griddle cakes when there was nothing else in the house. No eggs, no milk, no butter. The flour got mixed with just enough water to form a loose dough, then pressed flat by hand and cooked until the edges browned and curled. Some families drizzled a little honey on top. Others ate them plain with black coffee. Children would stack 3 or 4 on a plate and roll them up like tubes. The dish had no name in most households. It was just what you made when the pantry was bare. By the time packaged tortillas arrived in grocery stores, there was no reason to make them anymore. They vanished without anyone noticing. Number 24, Requesón con tortillas. Requesón was the Mexican version of ricota, made from the leftover whey after pressing queso fresco. It was soft, mild, and slightly grainy. In rural Jalisco and Michoacán, and later in Mexican-American kitchens across California, it was a breakfast staple. You spread it on a warm tortilla, added a stripe of salsa verde, and folded it in half. The cheese was so fresh it had to be eaten the same day it was made. Nobody sold it in a store because it did not last long enough to package. When families stopped making their own queso fresco at home, the Requesón disappeared with it. Today you can find it in a handful of Mexican markets in Los Angeles and San Antonio, but most people under 50 have never tasted it. Number 23, Gorditas de nata. Thick, round corn cakes made with nata, the heavy cream skimmed off the top of fresh, raw milk before anyone had heard of pasteurization. The nata gave the masa a richness that butter could not replicate, a slight tang underneath the corn flavor that made these gorditas taste like they came from a different kitchen than the ones made with plain lard. In the ranching towns of Zacatecas and Aguascalientes, families who kept their own cows made gorditas de nata on weekend mornings when the cream had built up from the week. The dough was patted thick, almost an inch, and cooked on a dry comal until the outside cracked and darkened while the inside stayed soft and dense. You pulled them apart with your hands and ate them with salsa or just a sprinkle of salt. When families stopped keeping cows and the milk came from a carton, the nata disappeared from the kitchen. Store-bought cream was not the same. The bacteria that gave raw nata its complexity had been killed, and the gorditas made with it tasted flat. The dish survived only where someone still had access to a cow, and that circle got smaller every decade. Number 22, Frijoles maneados. Maneados means stirred by hand, and that is exactly how these beans were made. Pinto beans cooked until soft, then mashed in the pot with a wooden spoon while strips of asadero cheese melted into them. The result was thick, stretchy, and rich, somewhere between refried beans and fondue. In Chihuahua and across Sonora, this was a breakfast plate on its own, served with flour tortillas and a cup of coffee. The key was the cheese. Asadero had to be fresh, and it had to be local. Without it, the beans were just beans. When factory-made cheese replaced the handmade stuff in most kitchens, frijoles maneados lost their texture and their point. The dish still exists in a few northern Mexican restaurants, but the homemade version has nearly disappeared. Number 21. Migas. Stale tortillas never went to waste. When a stack of corn tortillas dried out and cracked, they got torn into small pieces and tossed into a hot skillet with a little lard. Once they crisped up, eggs were cracked directly over them, and the whole thing got scrambled together with tomato, onion, and serrano chile. The tortilla pieces soaked up the egg and softened just enough to hold together without going limp. Some families added a handful of shredded cheese on top while the eggs were still wet. It was a 5-minute meal that cost almost nothing and used food that would have been thrown away in any other kitchen. Field workers carried migas wrapped in foil to the cotton fields because they tasted just as good cold 4 hours later. The name itself meant crumbs, which tells you everything about where this dish came from and how little it required. Number 20. Empanadas de Calabaza. Forget the fancy meat-filled empanadas sold in restaurants today. These were sweet turnovers filled with mashed pumpkin cooked down with piloncillo, cinnamon, and a pinch of anise. The dough was simple, just flour, lard, water, and a little salt, rolled thin and crimped shut with a fork. Families made them in the fall when calabaza was cheap and plentiful at the market. A single large pumpkin produced enough filling for 3 or 4 dozen empanadas, and they kept for days wrapped in cloth on the kitchen counter. Children carried them to school in their pockets, still warm from the morning fry. The filling had a deep caramel sweetness that came entirely from the piloncillo and the long, slow cooking, no refined sugar needed. In some families, these empanadas marked the start of autumn as reliably as the first cold front rolling through the valley. Number 19. Albóndigas en caldo. Meatball soup stretched a small amount of ground beef further than almost any other dish a migrant family could make. The secret was in the filler. Mothers mixed the meat with cooked rice, a beaten egg, and sometimes a handful of masa or breadcrumbs, rolling each ball between their palms until the portions looked generous, even though the actual beef content was modest. The broth was built from whatever the kitchen held: tomato, onion, garlic, a few chunks of potato, sliced calabacita, maybe a carrot or two if the season was right. The whole pot simmered for close to an hour while the meatballs poached gently and released their fat into the liquid, turning a thin vegetable broth into something rich and cloudy and feeling. 1 pound of ground beef produced enough albóndigas to fill a large olla that fed a family of 8 with bowls to spare. The potatoes and squash absorbed the meaty flavor and made each serving feel heavier than it really was. In the colonias along the South Texas border, this was the soup mothers reached for when someone came down with a cold or a fever, because the hot broth and the soft vegetables went down easy and the garlic was believed to chase illness out of the body. But albóndigas was not only a sick day remedy. It showed up on regular weeknights too, especially in the cooler months from November through February, when a warm bowl after dark felt like the only real comfort the day had offered. Children fished the meatballs out first and ate them like prizes, counting who got the most, then spooned through the broth, slowly looking for the softest pieces of potato hiding at the bottom. The leftovers thickened overnight in the icebox and came back the next day as something closer to a stew than a soup, which most families actually preferred. Nobody wrote down a recipe for albóndigas en caldo. The proportion shifted with whatever happened to be available that week, and that flexibility was the whole point of the dish. It asked for almost nothing, and returned a full pot every time. Number 18. Calabaza con puerco. When the squash came in during late summer, it showed up in everything. This dish paired chunks of calabaza with small pieces of pork, usually the cheapest cuts, stewed together in a simple broth of tomato, onion, garlic, and green chili. The pork gave the squash a rich, meaty flavor, and the squash stretched a small amount of meat into a full dinner. Corn cut fresh off the cob went in during the last few minutes. Some families added sprigs of epazote for that sharp, almost medicinal bite that you either loved or picked out of your bowl. The dish cost very little because squash grew fast and plentiful in South Texas gardens, and the pork could be whatever piece the butcher had left over at the end of the day. Number 17. Frijoles charros. Plain beans were survival. Frijoles charros were celebration disguised as survival. A pot of pinto beans simmered with bacon ends, a stub of chorizo, diced tomato, onion, jalapeno, and a fistful of cilantro thrown in at the last minute. The name came from the charros, the horsemen of rural Mexico, and the dish carried that same rough abundance. Everything in the kitchen that might otherwise go to waste found its way into the pot. Bacon rinds, a ham bone from the week before, the last inch of a chorizo link too small to fry on its own. The beans cooked down in all of that rendered fat and smoke until the broth turned dark and thick enough to coat the back of a wooden spoon. For families who could not afford a proper cut of meat, a bowl of frijoles charros with a stack of hot flour tortillas was as close to a barbecue as a Tuesday night would ever get. The dish tasted like someone had spent hours building it, and the truth was that someone had, standing over that pot stirring and adjusting the salt, because getting the broth exactly right was the one thing no shortcut in the world could replace. Number 16. Chileatole. This thick, savory corn soup confused people who had never tasted it because it sat somewhere between atole and pozole and did not quite fit either category. Fresh corn kernels or masa were dissolved into a warm broth with roasted poblano chiles, epazote, and sometimes a few shreds of chicken. The result was a creamy, slightly spicy porridge that stuck to your ribs on cold mornings. Chileatole was an ancient pre-Hispanic food that families carried from central Mexico to Texas as naturally as they carried their language. It required almost no money: corn, chile, water, salt. The flavor came from the roasting and the slow dissolving of the masa, not from expensive ingredients. By the 1960s, it was already becoming hard to find outside of the oldest households. Number 15. Huevos rancheros. A fried egg on a warm corn tortilla, smothered in salsa roja. That was it. The beauty of huevos rancheros was its absolute simplicity, and the fact that a dozen eggs and a few dried chiles could feed a family breakfast for an entire week. The salsa was the key. Dried guajillo chiles, toasted and rehydrated, blended with tomato and garlic into a smooth brick red sauce poured over the eggs while they were still sizzling. Some families added refried beans on the side. Others crumbled queso fresco over the top. Ranch workers ate this before dawn because it was fast, filling, and kept your hands warm while you ate. The name tells you where it came from. These were ranch eggs, food for people who worked the land and needed fuel before the sun was fully up. Diners serve a version of huevos rancheros today, with careful garnishes and avocado slices, but it has almost nothing in common with what came out of a cast iron skillet at 5 in the morning near Laredo. Number 14. Lentejas con chorizo. Lentils cooked faster than any other dried legume in the Mexican pantry, and that speed alone explained why they showed up on weeknight tables across South Texas when time and money had both run out. No overnight soaking required. Just a rinse under the faucet, straight into the pot with water, a dried bay leaf, and a smashed clove of garlic. While the lentils simmered, a skillet went on the next burner with crumbled chorizo, diced white onion, a chopped tomato, and a few thin coins of jalapeno. Once the lentils had softened but still held their shape, the chorizo mixture got stirred in, and the whole pot cooked together for another 20 minutes until the broth thickened into something halfway between a soup and a stew, stained deep reddish brown by the rendered chorizo fat. Some cooks dropped in cubes of potato to stretch the pot further, and the potato absorbed that smoky grease so completely it almost tasted like meat on its own. Others added chunks of ripe plantain for a faint sweetness that balanced the heat from the chilies. A bag of dried lentils at the local mercado cost next to nothing, and a single link of chorizo flavored the entire batch. That equation, a tiny amount of seasoned pork doing the work of a full roast, governed almost every weeknight meal migrant families in the valley managed to put on the table. You did not need much. You needed the right much. Families who had come north from Guanajuato or Zacatecas recognized this dish the moment they smelled it, because lentejas existed in nearly identical form across most of central Mexico. It was one of the few meals that tasted exactly like home, even when home was 600 miles south on the other side of the river. The dish began disappearing from regular rotation, not because anyone stopped liking it, but because canned soups became cheaper and faster, and a generation grew up thinking lentils were something only the old folks still bothered to prepare. Number 13. Tortas de camarón seco. If you grew up Catholic and Mexican in 1950s Texas, you already know what this is. During Lent, when meat was forbidden on Fridays, dried shrimp became the protein that carried families through 6 weeks of meatless meals. The shrimp came in small cellophane bags, already dried and salted, and they lasted for months in the pantry. Mothers ground them into a coarse powder, mixed them with egg and a little flour, and shaped them into small patties that were fried until golden and crispy. The patties went into a bath of caldillo, a thin tomato and chili sauce with sliced nopal cactus, and sometimes potatoes. The smell of dried shrimp frying was so strong and so distinct that neighbors knew it was Friday without checking a calendar. It was not a dish anyone would have chosen over carne asada on a regular Friday. But it was honest, filling, and it kept the faith. The recipe varied from household to household, and every family swore theirs was the right one. If your family made these during Lent, you already know that dried shrimp smell never left your hands for the rest of the day. Number 12. Chiles rellenos. A fresh poblano chile, roasted over the stove burner until the skin blistered and blackened, then peeled, split open, and stuffed with a slice of queso fresco or a spoonful of picadillo. The stuffed chile got dipped in a fluffy egg batter and fried in hot oil until the outside turned golden and the cheese inside melted into a soft, stretchy center. Chiles rellenos took more effort than most meals on this list, and that was why they showed up on special occasions, birthdays, feast days, or when a relative came to visit from across the border. A plate of 3 or 4 with a ladleful of tomato caldillo and a side of rice felt expensive, even though the ingredients cost almost nothing. The poblanos grew easily in Texas soil, and the queso came from a neighbor's cow more often than from a store. Number 11. Tripa. This is the dish that divides every family reunion in half. You either grew up loving tripas or you spent your childhood refusing to touch them. Tripa are cleaned intestines, usually from a cow, boiled until tender, and then fried on a flat comal until they turned crispy and golden on the edges. The smell was strong. There is no polite way to describe it. But the taste, when they were cooked right, was rich and chewy, with a slight crunch that was completely unlike anything else on the table. In 1950s Texas, tripas cost almost nothing because most butchers considered them waste. Mexican families saw something different. They saw a cheap protein that could stretch across a dozen tacos when chopped and served with cilantro, onion, and a squeeze of lime. Tripa were nose-to-tail eating decades before any restaurant chef turned that idea into a trend. Number 10. Mole de olla. Not the thick, chocolate-laced mole that takes 2 days to grind and blend. Mole de olla was its simpler, rougher cousin, a broth-based stew built around the cheapest beef the butcher sold. Shank bones, short ribs with more bone than meat, sometimes a hunk of neck still on the vertebra. The beef went into the pot with dried ancho and pasilla chilies that had been toasted on the comal until they blistered, soaked in hot water, and blended into a dark paste. Chunks of chayote squash, green beans snapped by hand, corn on the cob broken in half, and sliced zucchini filled out the rest. The pot simmered for hours until the broth turned deep, nearly black, and carried a smoky heat that tasted far more complex than its humble ingredients had any right to produce. Bone and connective. Tissue melted slowly into the liquid and gave it a body that no amount of seasoning could fake. The vegetables did the work of volume. The broth did the work of flavor, and the few tender bites of beef clinging to each bone gave just enough protein to make it feel like a proper meal at the end of a long day in the fields. Number 9. Asado de puerco. The word asado means roasted, but nobody in 1950s Texas was roasting anything for this dish. It was a braise, slow and patient. Chunks of pork shoulder went into a heavy pot with a sauce made from dried red chilies, usually guajillo with a few New Mexico chilies mixed in for their sweetness. The chilies were toasted until they puffed and darkened, soaked in hot water, and blended with garlic and a pinch of cumin. The pork sat in that sauce over low heat for hours until it surrendered completely, falling apart at the pressure of a fork, every piece coated in a thick, dark chile paste that clung and stained fingers and perfumed the whole kitchen. On Christmas Eve, asado de puerco was the centerpiece in many valley households. The rest of the year, it appeared whenever pork shoulder went on sale at the carniceria. A 2-pound shoulder braised in chili sauce stretched across 2 full days of eating, and the leftover sauce alone was worth saving because it turned the next morning's scrambled eggs into something that tasted like a second feast. Number 8. Gorditas de Harina. Thick, palm-sized pockets of flour dough fried in lard until the outside cracked and the inside stayed soft and steaming. Gorditas were the original handheld meal of northern Mexico and the Texas border, older than tacos in many families and more forgiving of whatever filling happened to be available that day. The dough was simple: flour, lard, salt, warm water, sometimes a pinch of baking powder to give them a slight puff when they hit the oil. Each one was patted out by hand, thicker than a tortilla but smaller around, and fried in a shallow pool of rendered lard in a cast iron skillet. The moment they came out of the oil, a knife split them open along the seam and the filling went in. Refried beans and cheese on a lean day, chicharrones in salsa verde when the family had a little more, picadillo with potatoes when ground beef was on sale, rajas con queso when the garden produced more peppers than anyone could eat fresh. The gordita itself was the vehicle, and the vehicle cost almost nothing to build. A 5-pound sack of flour and a block of lard made enough gorditas for a week if the cook was careful with her portions. In the colonias and ranchos along the border, gorditas were what women made standing at the stove with one hand on the skillet and the other handing food directly to children as they came through the kitchen. There was no plating, no sitting down, no ceremony. Just dough, fat, heat, and whatever was left in the pantry given a shape that turned it into something whole. By the time flour tortillas became thin and machine-pressed in the decades that followed, the gordita had already started fading from daily cooking because the extra dough and frying oil felt like a luxury that thinner, quicker tortillas did not require. Number 7. Nopalitos con huevo. Cactus paddles grew wild behind every other house in the barrios of Texas and Arizona, and Mexican-American mothers in the 70s knew exactly when to cut them. Young nopales, the tender pads no bigger than a man's hand, got their spines scraped off with a knife, diced into half-inch squares, and boiled for 10 minutes with a clove of garlic and a quarter onion. The slime came off in the water. Then the nopalitos went into a hot pan with bacon grease and 3 beaten eggs scrambled around them. A pinch of salt, a torn warm tortilla on the side, and breakfast was on the table for the cost of nothing but the gas to cook it. Mothers in San Antonio and the colonias of South Texas served nopalitos con huevo on the mornings when even the egg budget was thin, because the cactus stretched 2 eggs into a meal for 4. It was the breakfast of the land itself. Number 6. Capirotada. This was the one tias still defend like it was a gift from God, and they are not wrong. Mexican bread pudding made during Lent was the dessert that turned stale bolillo bread, brown sugar, and pantry stragglers into something so good that grown men got quiet at the table. The bolillos got sliced thick, toasted in the oven until they crackled, and then layered in a deep baking dish with shredded longhorn cheese, raisins, peanuts, and slices of banana when the fruit man had a good week. Over the top went a syrup made from piloncillo melted with water, a stick of canela, 2 cloves, and a slice of orange peel. The whole thing baked for 40 minutes, while the kitchen filled with a smell that made every kid in the barrio find a reason to come home early. The cheese melted into the bread, the syrup soaked everything, and the top got a crackly crust the color of mahogany. Tias in El Paso and San Antonio guarded their recipes like ancestral land deeds, each swearing the secret was the banana or the cheese or the second clove. Lent meant no meat, no celebration, and a household watching every penny. But capirotada turned scarcity into ceremony. A pan cost 90 cents to assemble and fed a family of 7 through 3 nights of after-dinner spoonfuls. That was the meal nobody admitted was their favorite until they were 80. The meal that proved the cheapest pantry in the barrio could still make something sacred. Number 5. Carne guisada. Stew meat was the cheapest beef at the carniceria, and Mexican-American mothers in the 70s turned it into Sunday dinner with patience and a heavy lid. 2 pounds of cubed chuck, the kind with the most gristle and the lowest price, got browned in a Dutch oven with a spoonful of bacon grease until every side was deep brown. In went a chopped onion, 2 cloves of garlic, a heaping spoon of flour to make the gravy, and a can of Hunt's tomato sauce thinned with water. The pot simmered low for 2 hours while the beef gave up everything it had and turned into something tender enough to fall apart under a fork. Served over rice or scooped into warm flour tortillas with a spoon of frijoles on the side, carne guisada was the meal that proved cheap cuts plus slow heat equaled luxury. The leftover gravy became Monday's breakfast tacos with a fried egg cracked on top. Number 4. Soaps. Thick little masa cakes with a pinched edge were the way barrio mothers turned a pound of corn flour into dinner for 8. The masa got mixed with warm water and a pinch of salt, rolled into balls the size of a golf ball, then pressed flat into rounds about a 1/4 inch thick. They cooked on a dry comal for 2 minutes a side, and the trick was pinching the edge up while still warm to make a small wall around the rim. The soaps got fried in shallow oil for 20 seconds to crisp the bottom, then topped with refried beans, shredded lettuce, crumbled queso fresco, and a spoon of salsa roja. Whatever bits of leftover meat the week had produced went on top. Mothers in the colonias of South Texas served soaps on Friday nights because they stretched the smallest amount of meat into the most impressive-looking plate. 3 soaps felt like a feast for 50 cents. Number 3. Atole de avena. Oatmeal atole was the breakfast that mothers reached for when the cereal box had been empty for 3 days and payday was still around the corner. A cup of plain Quaker oats from the cardboard cylinder went into a pot of water with a stick of canela, simmered for 10 minutes until it turned thick, then got finished with a splash of evaporated milk from the can and a heaping spoon of sugar. Some abuelas added a piece of piloncillo instead of sugar, and the brown sweetness turned the whole pot into something that tasted like a hug. Kids in the barrios of East LA in the 70s drank atole de avena from coffee mugs on cold school mornings, the cinnamon stick still floating in the cup, and walked to the bus stop with full bellies and warm hands. It cost about 12 cents a serving and filled a child until the recess bell rang. Number 2. Enchiladas rojas. Red enchiladas in a barrio kitchen had nothing to do with the cheese-stuffed restaurant version. The sauce was the whole point. Dried guajillo and ancho chiles got toasted on the comal, soaked in hot water, then blended with garlic, half an onion, a pinch of cumin, and a square of stale bread to thicken everything. The corn tortillas got a quick swim through the hot sauce, just 2 seconds aside, then rolled around a fistful of shredded leftover chicken from Sunday's caldo. 3 rolled enchiladas went on each plate, topped with another ladle of sauce, a sprinkle of chopped raw onion, and a crumble of queso fresco. Working mothers in places like the Rio Grande Valley made enchiladas rojas on Tuesday nights because Sunday's chicken had to keep earning its place at the table. A plate of 3 cost about 30 cents to assemble and made any weeknight feel like a celebration. Number 1. Mole con huevo. Leftover mole from last night's dinner, reheated in a skillet, with eggs cracked directly into the thick, dark sauce and stirred until the eggs cooked through and absorbed the color and flavor of the mole. The mole could be any kind. Mole negro, mole rojo, mole de olla. Whatever had been made in quantity the day before and still sat in its pot on the stove. The egg stretched what remained into a full new meal. You needed nothing else, just a stack of warm tortillas and a willingness to eat chocolate and chile at 7 in the morning. In households across Oaxaca, Puebla, and in Mexican-American kitchens from Los Angeles to San Antonio, mole con huevo was the breakfast that proved no good mole was ever wasted. The richness of the sauce, built from dozens of ingredients over hours of grinding and toasting, transferred into the eggs in a way that made the simplest protein taste like the most elaborate thing on the table. When the tradition of making mole from scratch at home slowed down, the morning after breakfast disappeared with it. None of those breakfasts came from a box or a drive-through window. They came from someone who stood at a stove before sunrise and made something out of what was already there. If you grew up with any of these plates on your table, drop a comment and tell us which one your family still makes. Like the video, share it with someone who would recognize these kitchens, and subscribe if you have not already. We will keep reaching into the recipes that deserve to be remembered.